Clarity begins not in the external world, but in the internal terrain of the brain, and the first step toward accessing it is through state control, the ability to shift your internal environment from chaos to coherence, because the brain operates in different states, and these states determine what kind of thoughts and behaviors are even possible at any given moment. So when people say they can't focus, or they feel foggy or anxious or dull, what they often mean is that they are in the wrong physiological state to support clarity. And that's not a flaw of character, it's a biological imbalance, something that can be redirected through specific, repeatable actions. And the foundation of that redirection is autonomic regulation, the ability to shift the autonomic nervous system from the sympathetic branch, which governs fight, flight, and stress, to the parasympathetic branch, which promotes calm alertness, the very state where clarity naturally resides. And one of the fastest, most powerful ways to do this is through the breath, because respiration is one of the few bodily systems that is both automatic and under voluntary control. And this gives us a unique entry point into the nervous system itself. So by controlling the breath, we can influence heart rate, brain wave activity, and hormone release, which together change the overall state of the mind. And among all breath techniques, one of the most immediately effective is what's called the physiological sigh. A double inhale followed by a long, extended exhale, because this pattern naturally reduces carbon dioxide and activates neurons in the brainstem that promote calm. And what's remarkable is that this can be done in real time, in just 2 or 3 cycles, without needing to retreat into silence or spend hours in meditation. And when done consistently, it begins to train the brain toward a baseline of calm clarity, a kind of neural readiness where the noise of the world doesn't overwhelm, because the system is no longer reactive but responsive. And when you learn to enter this state on command, everything changes, your focus sharpens, decisions become easier, and emotions lose their destabilizing grip, not because they disappear, because your internal environment is stable enough to hold them without being pulled into their chaos. And this is the critical point that most people overlook. Clarity is not about removing all stress or shutting out the world. It's about creating an internal condition where even in the midst of stress, the signal doesn't get lost in the noise. And that starts by mastering the fundamental physiological tools that govern state. Because once your nervous system is in alignment, your perception changes, your thinking becomes more precise, your speech becomes more deliberate, and your actions gain a kind of grounded momentum. And from that place, you're not just reacting to life, you're shaping it, directing it, and engaging with it from a position of agency and depth, which is ultimately what clarity is: capacity to see what matters and to act from that place without distraction or distortion pulling you off course. Visual focus is not just a function of seeing clearly, it is a gateway into cognitive clarity, because the brain and the visual system are deeply intertwined, with over 40% of the brain's circuitry linked to vision in some way, making the eyes not only instruments of perception, but direct influencers of our mental state. And what we often miss is how much control we actually have over this system in day-to-day life, because while we think of focus as something mental, something abstract, it is in fact a physical process initiated by the way we use our eyes, and when we deliberately narrow our visual field, fixing our gaze on a single object or point, we engage a bottom-up mechanism that signals to the brain that something important is happening, which then triggers a neurochemical cascade involving norepinephrine and acetylcholine, sharpening our attention, suppressing irrelevant noise, and anchoring our cognitive resources on the task at hand. And this isn't metaphoric, it's biological, it's measurable. And it means that every time you bring your eyes into focused attention, you are actually sculpting the neural environment for clarity, not through effortful thought, but through directed sensory engagement. And just as we can turn this mechanism on, we can also turn it off or reset it through what's called panoramic vision, where instead of focusing on one thing, we soften the eyes and take in the entire visual field, letting the gaze widen naturally across the horizon, which reduces sympathetic arousal and tells the brain that the environment is safe, decreasing cortisol levels and enabling a more relaxed, creative, and open state of awareness. And the powerful insight here is that we can shift between these two modes: narrow visual focus for intense work, panoramic vision for decompression and creativity, by simply adjusting our gaze. No apps, no devices, no chemicals, just leveraging the biological tools already embedded within us. And the implications are massive, because once you realize that clarity is not about pushing harder or forcing thoughts to align, but about setting the right visual conditions, you begin to use your body and your brain in harmony. And this kind of deliberate vision training becomes a form of mental conditioning, a way to signal to the brain when it's time to dial in and when it's time to release. And the more you practice this, the faster your nervous system responds, the more automatic the transitions become, until eventually, with enough consistency, you've built a brain that understands what to do in each context, how to focus when needed, how to relax when required, and how to sustain clarity not just in ideal conditions but even under pressure, because your visual system has been trained to lead the way, anchoring your awareness, stabilizing your state, and creating the neural signature of clarity without needing willpower or motivation to prop it up, allowing you to move through life with more presence, more control, and a deeper connection to the moment in front of you. Dopamine is one of the most misunderstood chemicals in the brain because it's often reduced to the idea of pleasure or reward, but in reality, it's the driver of effort, the neurochemical that determines what you pay attention to, what you pursue, and how long you're willing to endure the discomfort of progress. And this has everything to do with clarity, because without a directed dopamine system, the mind becomes scattered, reactive, jumping from one stimulus to the next without depth. without coherence, and certainly without sustained focus. And the key insight here is that dopamine is not just released when you get something. It's released when you anticipate progress, when you believe you're moving in the right direction. And that means the brain is constantly evaluating effort versus reward, constantly deciding whether to continue or to stop based on tiny fluctuations in perceived progress. And this is where clarity becomes a biological process, not a motivational one, because if you can learn to anchor dopamine to effort itself, not just outcomes, you create a loop in the brain that drives sustained attention and mental energy. And this is something that can be trained through repetition and awareness, because each time you acknowledge a small step taken, each time you mentally register that what you're doing is useful, you reinforce the dopamine pathway that supports long-term clarity and drive, and over time, this changes your internal reward system, pulling it away from instant gratification and toward deep, purposeful engagement. And what's especially powerful is that this doesn't require dramatic achievement or external praise. It just requires internal tracking of progress, the kind of quiet self-recognition that says, I am building something, I am moving forward even when no one sees it, and that becomes the seed of intrinsic motivation. A chemical alignment between what you care about and what your brain is reinforcing. And the more you strengthen this circuit, the more naturally your brain filters out distractions, because dopamine doesn't just energize, it says this is what matters right now, this is what deserves your attention, and everything else becomes background noise, not through suppression or willpower, but through disinterest, because the brain simply stops assigning value to the irrelevant. And the more you practice this, the more clarity becomes a default setting, a way of interacting with the world that is rooted in direction, not confusion. And the practical takeaway is that if you want clarity, you don't start with the big vision. You start with one step, you make it count, and you mentally mark it as progress, then you repeat, stacking tiny moments of dopamine reinforcement until the brain learns what the path looks like and how it feels. And once that pattern is established, it becomes easier to stay on track, easier to filter input, easier to know what matters and why, because the brain is no longer searching in the dark. It's following a line of reward that you've intentionally laid down. And from that place, clarity isn't fragile or fleeting. It's stable, embodied, and repeatable. Brain does not operate in a vacuum but follows rhythms, cycles, and patterns governed by internal clocks, and one of the most influential of these is the circadian rhythm, a roughly 24-hour cycle that regulates sleep, alertness, hormone release, temperature, and cognitive performance. And this rhythm is not just about when you sleep or wake, but when your brain is primed for clarity, for deep thinking, for high performance. And understanding this rhythm gives you access to natural windows of enhanced focus and reduced mental resistance. And one of the most potent anchors of this rhythm is light, specifically bright light exposure early in the day, which signals to a part of the brain called the suprachiasmatic nucleus that it's time to wake up, setting off a cascade of hormonal responses, including the rise of cortisol. Contrary to popular belief, is not just a stress hormone but a signal of alertness and readiness when released at the appropriate time. And this rise typically occurs 45 to 90 minutes after waking, creating a peak window for cognitive clarity, which can be used for high-leverage tasks like problem solving, deep work, or strategic thinking. And what's critical here is that the timing of your behavior needs to match this internal biology, because doing the most demanding mental work during the times when your brain is naturally less alert, such as late afternoon or immediately upon waking without movement or light, leads to friction, fatigue, and reduced clarity, not because of lack of effort, but because of misalignment with neurobiology. And the good news is that this alignment can be trained and stabilized by consistent wake times, daily exposure to natural sunlight, and avoidance of bright artificial light late at night, which disrupts melatonin release and impairs the quality of sleep and the reset of your circadian clock. And when you begin to structure your day around these principles, early sunlight, focused work during the cortisol peak, light movement post-waking, and reducing blue light at night, you build a rhythm that optimizes the brain's capacity for focus without requiring additional effort. And this rhythm also helps regulate dopamine timing, mood stability, and mental endurance, allowing for clearer thinking, quicker problem solving, and deeper insight, because your internal environment is no longer fighting against external demands. And beyond just one peak in the morning, the brain also goes through secondary peaks in the late morning or early evening depending on individual chronotype. So learning to recognize your own personal rhythm, when you feel most alert, when you feel naturally tired, is a form of self-mastery that enables you to plan tasks and priorities around your neurophysiology instead of against it. And the result of this alignment is a more stable baseline of clarity that doesn't depend on external motivation but on internal precision. And when you consistently live in sync with your circadian biology, you not only gain more control over your focus and energy, you build a kind of mental reliability that allows you to enter clarity on command, not through force but through rhythm. Mental fatigue is not a sign of weakness or lack of motivation, but a direct consequence of how the brain allocates and consumes energy, especially in the prefrontal cortex, the area responsible for focus, planning, and impulse control. And like any resource, this energy is finite and depletes with use, which means clarity cannot be sustained indefinitely without strategic renewal. And this is where most people go wrong, believing that pushing through exhaustion is a badge of discipline, when in reality it is a recipe for diminishing returns and cognitive clutter. Because the neural circuits responsible for high-level thinking do not thrive under constant pressure. They require cycles of activation and recovery, and these cycles are not random. They follow patterns that can be harnessed, and one of the most effective approaches is working in focused intervals, typically ranging from 25 to 90 minutes. followed by deliberate breaks, not passive scrolling or digital input, but real decompression, ideally involving physical movement, visual reset, or nature exposure. And these breaks serve to clear the neural buildup that interferes with mental clarity, allowing the default mode network to activate, which is the system in the brain linked to insight, self-reflection, and memory consolidation. And when given space to operate, this network helps integrate what was just learned or processed during the focused work period, meaning that rest is not the absence of productivity, but a different mode of it, one that is essential for sustained clarity, and if ignored, leads to burnout, distraction, and mental fog. And what's powerful is that this isn't about working less, it's about working in alignment with how the brain is designed, because when you honor these natural cognitive rhythms, you not only preserve energy, you increase the depth and quality of your thinking. And this applies just as much to physical posture and visual input, because prolonged sitting, shallow breathing, and staring at screens narrow the mind and reduce cognitive flexibility. So integrating brief walks, eye movement exercises, or even stepping outdoors to shift into panoramic vision can restore alertness and improve mental endurance. And another often overlooked factor is hydration and nutrition, because glucose is the brain's primary energy source, and small drops in blood sugar or dehydration can mimic symptoms of mental fatigue. So the foundation of clarity must include biological maintenance. And this means treating the brain like the high-functioning organ it is, not expecting it to run smoothly on stress and overstimulation alone. And when you combine these practices, structured work intervals, deliberate recovery, physical movement, breath awareness, and metabolic support, you begin to build a brain that is not only capable of clarity but resilient under pressure, adaptive in changing conditions, and consistent across time. And this consistency is what separates momentary focus from a sustainable clarity that shows up not only during peak moments but also in the grind, the quiet hours, and the uncertainty of life. Because the brain has been trained to function well not through force but through understanding and precision, clarity is not just a product of internal processes but is deeply influenced by the environment we place ourselves in, and the brain is constantly in dialogue with its surroundings, filtering sensory data, responding to signals of safety or threat, novelty or monotony, and shaping perception and cognition accordingly. And this means that the spaces we inhabit either support or sabotage our mental clarity, not in abstract or aesthetic terms, but in concrete neurobiological ways. Because cluttered environments lead to divided attention, forcing the brain to process excess visual information, which taxes working memory and increases cognitive load. And over time, this drains energy from the very systems responsible for focus and decision, making it harder to think clearly, make priorities, or stay emotionally regulated. And the opposite is also true, because when we reduce sensory noise and design our environment with intention, we create a space that signals to the brain that clarity is possible. And this doesn't mean sterile minimalism, but conscious design, eliminating unnecessary inputs, establishing visual order, using natural light, limiting digital distraction, and introducing cues that promote focus like defined work zones, calming colors, or even specific scents associated with productivity, because the olfactory system has a direct line to the brain's limbic structures, meaning certain smells can modulate mood and alertness without needing thought or effort. And this becomes especially important in digital environments. The absence of physical space makes boundaries harder to establish, so creating digital clarity through focused apps, time-blocked usage, and reducing screen clutter is a modern necessity for mental discipline. And what we often overlook is how much of this is trainable, how much of our reactivity to environment is a habit, and how quickly the brain begins to respond to environmental patterns, reinforcing them over time. Which means that consistency is key, because the more frequently you return to the same conditions for focus, the more efficient the brain becomes at entering a clear and alert state in that context, almost like a neural association between place and performance. And this association can be leveraged to create clarity triggers, specific locations, objects, rituals, or even sounds that reliably anchor you into the mindset needed for deep thought and presence. And once these are established, they reduce the amount of cognitive energy needed to transition into focus, allowing the brain to conserve resources and perform more fluidly. And when this is combined with control over social environment, choosing when to engage, how to manage interruptions, and where to place your attention, you begin to shape a life that supports cognitive excellence not through force but through structure, because structure, when aligned with neurobiology, is not restriction but freedom. A freedom to think more clearly, act more decisively, and feel more connected to what matters. And ultimately, clarity becomes not something you chase but something you step into, designed from the outside in and the inside out, a reflection of your choices, habits, and surroundings, all working in harmony with the natural architecture of the brain.